A very smart guy on Reddit asked, "What's the creepiest place you've been?" There's an abandoned mental hospital in my great-aunt's old neighborhood. We were at her house for Easter, and it was a nice day, so she suggested that we go for a walk. Looking back on it, I think that she walked there purposely. They had a playground, but all the equipment was made for adult-sized people. I started to play on it and then had a "what the hell" moment looking around. Like Alice in Wonderland. It was so bizarre. All overgrown. And then I asked what the building had been. Adults were having polite small talk and hadn't seemed to notice their setting. She explained what it had been. Adults looked kind of weirded out. I didn't see any ghosts or anything like that, but it was the most unsettling feeling. That was caused by a place. Operating room for brain surgery. It's freezing cold. They wheel you up to this stainless steel bed with a cage you put your head in. They tighten down clamps on your head so it can't move. Then knock you out. You wake up multiple times over a 4-hour surgery, semi-conscious, eyes closed, but you can say "I hear you guys," or snap your fingers and hold a finger up like waiter, and the anesthesiologist hits you with a dose. After they're done, they poke a giant needle into different facial muscles to make sure they didn't break anything. Poking it into a muscle causes a subconscious flinching, and they look at the muscle group flinching to make sure each category is still rigged up. I had a bunch of scabs and taped cotton balls across my face and scalp. Then they seal up your skull and sign off on it. They use reciprocating saws and similar power tools to carpenters. It's morbid, terrifying, cold. But it can give you your life back. I spent 2 nights in the hospital and was driving to work 7 days later feeling like $1,000,000. I went to a rest stop at 1 a.m. outside Springfield, Illinois a few years back. Went to the restroom and there was blood everywhere. It looked like something got slaughtered. I have never hightailed it out of somewhere so quickly beforehand. So a bit of context. This occurred at a rest stop along Highway 55 outside of Springfield. This was a very old rest stop, not a gas station. It happened in October, maybe November, of 2014. Pretty close to Halloween. When I was a kid, we lived in my dad's old house from when he was a kid. It was one of the oldest houses in town and had been there since the 1800s, but had been redone a few times. The house had 3 bedrooms. A master that used to be a screened-in porch, a regular room, and a room off to the side that was barely big enough for a twin bed. When my dad was about 11, his older brother died of heart failure, and they had his coffin put in that room for the viewing. When my grandfather died about 10 years later, his was put there too. When I was born, my grandmother offered the house to my parents as she'd gotten remarried, so they took it for $30 a month. That room always creeped me out for some reason growing up, and I didn't like going in there. When I was older and renting the house from my grandma myself, that's when my dad told me about the viewings. Still was a creepy room, and I kept only things I didn't use on a regular basis in there. One year I worked in a haunted house that was inside a building that used to be a funeral home. The morgue was downstairs and still had the drawers. My job was to lay in the drawer and pop out when people walked by. Laying in a cramped drawer, in the dark, on cold metal, with flashes of lights and screams in the distance, was probably the creepiest place. I scared so many people, including a middle school-aged kid who straight up pooped his pants and a drunk college chick who peed. So it was kind of worth it. The crypt, I think that's what it was, of a church in Bayeux, France. I was there on a school trip, and we could choose whether to go to this historically old church or see the Bayeux Tapestry. I chose the church. If I recall correctly, they had just found the crypt a couple of years before. So I was down there by myself, taking pictures, and after a couple of minutes I started feeling downright nauseous. Like, I'm going to get sick right here nauseous. Went upstairs to get some air, and the feeling went away instantly. Creeped me out, and when I went down with the group afterwards I felt totally fine. I was on a family vacation to Atlanta, about 1972. We went to visit some cousins of my grandmother's. Twin sisters, never married, in their 80s. The house was in a rundown neighborhood. From the street you'd think it was abandoned. Overgrown yard, part of the roof caved in, boarded up windows. Inside, it was all antiques and furniture from the 30s and 40s, slowly deteriorating, and it looked as though they hadn't dusted in years. Wallpaper peeling, old portraits half fallen. Looking up to the second floor from the stairs, just cobwebs and collapsed ceilings. They said they hadn't been up there in years. And definitely rat noises. They both looked and lived like ghosts and seemed half mad. Very civil and proper but off. As an 8-year-old, I was terrified, especially when one of them joked and said you should leave him here. He can live with us. I burst into tears and we left. More or less a combination of creepy and sad, but Cambodia. Went with family to see Angkor Wat, huge temple, an absolute marvel, was featured in Tomb Raider I believe, and stopped in the town center for a bite to eat with our guide. We wandered away from the guide just to explore a bit, and we were approached by a young girl, 15 to 16, carrying what looked to be a sleeping toddler. She asked us to buy milk for her baby, and we obliged because hey, babies need food. Just as we were about to walk into the store, our guide spots us and tells us to get in his car. We used it for transportation to and from a bunch of temples. The girl then starts screaming profanities at us and the guide, and we pile into our car. She started banging on the windows of the car while still screaming after the door was closed, and surprisingly enough the toddler still didn't wake up. We asked our guide what the hell just happened, and he relayed this to us. Apparently in Cambodia and some other countries, gangs will profit off of not only sex trafficking from children, but also a form of pity trafficking. They will take a small child like a toddler and drug them so they look as though they're sleeping. They'll pass the child off to a young girl who will beg for food, money, etc. and pose as the toddler's mother. Then, she'll pass the child off to a new girl who will repeat the act. They do this until the child wakes up, will feed them, and then start the process again. As the toddlers get older, they'll be taught to try and sell things to tourists. If they fail to meet a quota, they'll sometimes lose limbs, fingers, hands, arms, legs, and will then run a story about how they stepped on an old landmine. This is actually somewhat possible as the country is still reeling from the impact Pol Pot had, and there are still unearthed landmines, but the issue is that 1% are close to the main city Angkor Wat, which is where a majority of these children were. We were shocked to say the least. This seemed kind of far-fetched, but what else would we believe? We did some research online and found stuff about the sex trafficking, but not much about the toddler swapping and child mutilation. When we went into town the next day with our guide, what did we see? The same toddler being passed to a different girl, still knocked out, still in the same clothing. Definitely creepy. I loved Angkor Wat and thought it was beautiful, but I don't plan on going back there anytime soon. I had a friend who cleaned out and sold foreclosed homes for a living. He once took me on a ride to a house he had to photograph for the bank after it had gone into foreclosure. From the moment we got there, it was unsettling. It was in the area of a ski resort, and the neighborhood was wealthy, but once we stepped inside, it was clear that it had been used as a kind of boarding house for resort staff. Numbers outside each of the bedroom doors, large closets and weird spaces turned into bedrooms. The place was filthy, with black garbage bags everywhere, pizza boxes, booze bottles, like clearly a party house for staff, but recently abandoned. At one point, I was on the ground floor, and my friend was in the basement, when I suddenly got full body chills. I was standing in the kitchen, and there was a bathroom next to it with the door closed, and I somehow knew that there was someone hiding in that bathroom. At the very same instant, my friend called me down to the basement, where he had found a back corner which had been converted into another sleeping area. There was a television still on, just showing static, and a kitchen knife on a crate next to the mattress. That was the moment I stepped directly behind my 6'4", 300 pounds friend and told him we had to get the duck out of there. I'm pretty sure the home was being used as an illegal boarding house for undocumented resort workers, and I honestly felt bad for the terrified kid who was still squatting in the basement, but I sure as hell didn't want to find him. My old house. About 5 years ago I was living in a town just outside of Washington, D.C. The house was a short 2-story house with a basement that was built in the 50s. The whole house has a weird vibe to it, not exactly scary, but unsettling. In 2011, the year that we moved in, the guy that built the house stopped by. He told us that he built the house with his dad and 3 brothers in 1952. During the building they found a few skeletons while they were digging out the driveway and of course called the police. Turns out the bodies were Union soldiers from the Civil War who had most likely been killed during the Battle of Bull Run and buried as the Union Army marched back to D.C. Also, the basement was unfinished, flooded constantly, and had a spricket infestation. In high school, my friends and I would go up to the local abandoned state mental hospital to explore. The rooms were mostly creepy from the state of decay they were in. There was a lot of graffiti, with things like 666 and bands names, Tool, Marilyn Manson, spray painted on the walls. The graffiti wasn't creepy, just markings from other teenagers. Sometimes we would find bullet casings scattered on the floor. However, the creepiest area I saw were the underground tunnels. A security guard caught us on the property and told us to come back in a half hour after the statey did their rounds. We met up with him, and he took us down into the tunnels that staff would have used to travel between buildings. I just remember how dark it was, and he was the only one with a flashlight, as that cell phones at this time were Nokia bricks. The other creepy part was when he drove us around the property in his Dodge Caravan that had his cat in it. Dry cat food was all over the floor. 16-year-old me was really stupid. Even though nothing bad happened, it always sounds like the makings of a horror movie. My family went house hunting one weekend, and we came across one in Salem, Massachusetts, that had been built in the 1700s. It looked alright, inside and out. The lady who'd been showing us houses really tried to push us to commit to this one. It was a decent enough house size-wise and in pretty decent shape, but none of us could shake the eerie gut feeling we got as we were going through it. We all admitted that the creepy feeling was the strongest when we opened the basement door. None of us was brave enough to go down. When we got a moment to ourselves, my mom said she'd gotten the vibe that bad things had happened in that house. Like people had been killed or something. We all admitted we'd gotten the same feeling and politely noped right out of there.